There are moments in sports when a team accidentally tells you the truth long before any official announcement is made. No press release, no breaking news alert, no dramatic statement from the front office. Just a brief, almost invisible moment that slips through the cracks. Most people miss it because they're focused on the words being said. But sometimes, the real story isn't in the answer, it's in the reaction that comes before it. That's exactly what happened during Andrew Berry's recent media appearance. A straightforward question was asked about the Cleveland Browns quarterback situation, and for a split second, something happened that immediately caught the attention of fans who have been following this story closely. Before Berry could choose his words, before the familiar front office language kicked in, there was a reaction in the room that seemed impossible to ignore. It lasted less than a second, but for many Browns fans, that moment spoke louder than the entire interview that followed. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. The Browns continue to publicly describe the quarterback competition as an open competition. Officially, nobody has won anything. Training camp hasn't started, preseason games haven't been played. Every quarterback in the room still has an opportunity to prove himself. That's the message the organization wants everyone to hear. But when you step back and examine everything that was said during this media tour, another picture begins to emerge. Because the more Andrew Berry talked, the harder it became to ignore the difference in how he discussed certain players. Some answers were detailed, some were emotional. Some sounded like they came from someone who had been watching a young prospect develop day after day for months. Other answers felt much more cautious, much more measured, almost like a man carefully navigating a complicated situation that everyone already understands, but nobody wants to say out loud. Now, to be completely fair, nothing Andrew Berry said officially confirmed who will start for the Cleveland Browns this season. He never announced a winner. He never hinted that a decision had already been made behind closed doors, and anyone claiming otherwise is getting ahead of the facts. But what he did provide was something that might be even more revealing. He provided clues, small details, specific words, subtle differences in tone and emphasis that have sparked a massive debate among Browns fans and NFL analysts alike. The reason this has become such a hot topic is simple. The Browns aren't dealing with an ordinary quarterback competition. They're dealing with one of the most complicated quarterback situations in football. On one side is Deshaun Watson, the veteran quarterback whose arrival was supposed to change the future of the franchise. On the other side is Shedeur Sanders, the rookie who entered the organization surrounded by headlines, questions, expectations, and plenty of skepticism. Few people expected this conversation to become this serious, this quickly. Yet, here we are. What's even more interesting is that the deeper you dive into Berry's comments, the more difficult it becomes to dismiss the possibility that the organization may already have a preferred direction. Not officially, not publicly, but internally. The clues are everywhere if you're willing to look closely enough. The language he used, the examples he referenced, the players he compared. Even the way he described development and progress seemed to point toward a larger story unfolding behind the scenes. And what we're about to break down isn't based on one quote or one headline. It's based on the entire pattern, piece by piece, comment by comment, response by response. Because once you start connecting those dots, a very different picture of the Browns' quarterback competition begins to appear. A picture that may explain why so many Browns fans believe the future of this franchise is already taking shape before a single meaningful snap of training camp has even been played. And the most surprising part? The biggest clue may have come from a single word Andrew Berry used when discussing one quarterback, and the complete lack of that same energy when discussing the other. Once you hear it, you may never look at this competition the same way again. If there was one moment during Andrew Berry's media appearance that completely changed the conversation surrounding the Browns' quarterback battle, it wasn't a declaration, a prediction, or a major headline. It was a single word. In fact, it was a word that many people heard and immediately moved past. But the more you think about it, the more significant it becomes. When Berry discussed Shedeur Sanders' development throughout the offseason, he didn't rely on the kind of generic football language fans hear every year. He didn't say Sanders was improving. He didn't call him promising. He didn't use the standard phrases organizations often throw around when discussing young players. Instead, Barry described Sanders' progress in a way that immediately stood out. He spoke about the rookie's growth from January through minicamp with a level of enthusiasm that sounded noticeably different from his usual measured style. That's important because Andrew Barry has built a reputation throughout his career for being extremely careful with his words. Browns fans know this better than anyone. He rarely gives away information. He rarely allows emotions to slip into his public comments. Most of his press conferences are carefully constructed, professional, and intentionally vague. That's not criticism, it's part of the job. General managers are trained to reveal as little as possible while still answering questions. Every sentence is calculated, every phrase is chosen carefully, every response is designed to avoid creating unnecessary headlines. Which is exactly why this moment jumped out. Barry didn't simply praise Sanders. He went further than that. He described an entire developmental journey. He talked about work being done months before most fans were even paying attention. He referenced progress that began long before OTAs and minicamp practices started generating headlines. Instead of focusing on one impressive throw or one strong practice, Barry repeatedly emphasized the overall arc of Sanders' growth. Think about that for a second. Most front offices prefer to stay cautious when discussing rookie quarterbacks. The NFL is filled with examples of young players who looked great in spring workouts, only to struggle once the real competition began. Teams understand that, executives understand that, which is why they usually avoid attaching themselves too strongly to off-season hype. Yet Barry sounded like someone who had been tracking Sanders' progress every step of the way. And it wasn't just what he said, it was how specific he became. Rather than offering broad compliments, Barry talked about timelines. He talked about months of work. He discussed development that started during the quiet part of the offseason, when cameras weren't following every move and social media wasn't analyzing every practice clip. His comments painted the picture of an organization that had been closely monitoring a young quarterback's growth long before the public started paying attention. That's where things become especially interesting. Organizations don't accidentally invest that level of attention into players they view as temporary projects. They invest that attention into players they believe could become important pieces of the future. Again, that doesn't mean a decision has already been made. It doesn't mean Sanders has officially won anything. But it does suggest that the Browns have been taking his development extremely seriously from the moment he arrived. And perhaps the most revealing part was the confidence behind Barry's description. He didn't sound like someone hoping Sanders might eventually become something. He sounded like someone who had already seen enough evidence to believe meaningful progress was taking place. For Browns fans, that's a massive distinction. Hope and belief are not the same thing. Every team hopes its young players develop. Every front office hopes its draft picks exceed expectations. But belief comes from observation. Belief comes from seeing results firsthand. Belief comes from watching improvement happen over time. And when Barry described Sanders' journey, many listeners came away feeling like they were hearing belief rather than hope. That's why this moment resonated so strongly throughout Cleveland. Fans weren't reacting to a single compliment, they were reacting to the possibility that the Browns' general manager had accidentally revealed how highly the organization views its rookie quarterback. Because when someone as disciplined as Andrew Barry chooses unusually strong language, people naturally pay attention. And as revealing as those comments were, they become even more significant when compared to how Barry discussed the other quarterback in this competition. Because while one answer was filled with specifics, timelines, and visible enthusiasm, the next answer sounded very different. And that's where the real debate begins. If Andrew Barry's comments about Shedeur Sanders grabbed everyone's attention, what he said about Deshaun Watson may have raised even more questions. Not because the answer was dramatic, not because it contained a shocking revelation. In fact, the opposite is true. The answer was so carefully constructed, so professionally delivered, that many fans initially overlooked what made it so interesting. But once you slow it down and compare it side by side with how Barry discussed Sanders, the contrast becomes difficult to ignore. The question itself was straightforward. If Deshaun performs well and wins the job, could he still be the Browns' long-term answer at quarterback? That's not a trick question. It's exactly the type of question fans want answered after everything this organization has invested over the past several years. We're talking about one of the biggest trades in franchise history, one of the largest contracts the NFL has ever seen, and a quarterback whose arrival was supposed to completely transform the future of the Browns. So when that question was presented, many people expected Barry to offer some version of a strong endorsement. Not necessarily a guarantee, but something that reflected confidence in Watson's ability to reclaim his place as the face of the franchise. Instead, the answer went in a very different direction. Rather than focusing on Watson specifically, Barry immediately began discussing other quarterbacks. He referenced players who revived their careers after being written off. He mentioned examples around the league of quarterbacks who found success after difficult stretches. The message was clear. Football is unpredictable, and teams should never completely rule out a comeback story. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. After all, the NFL is full of examples of players exceeding expectations. Careers have been revived before. Quarterbacks have surprised people before. Nobody can accurately predict how every season will unfold. Barry's answer reflected that reality. But the deeper question isn't whether his comments were reasonable. The deeper question is why those particular examples were chosen in the first place. Because when you look closely, every quarterback Barry referenced shared something in common. These weren't examples of established franchise stars maintaining their status. These were examples of players who entered critical points in their careers with major doubts surrounding them. Players who had been questioned. Players who many people believed were finished as long-term starters. Players whose futures were uncertain until they unexpectedly changed the narrative. That's an interesting category to place someone in. Again, this doesn't prove anything. Barry never said Watson couldn't succeed. He never suggested Watson had no chance to win the job. He repeatedly emphasized that the competition remains open. But many fans couldn't help noticing that his examples seemed to frame Watson as a potential comeback story, rather than a quarterback the organization was openly building around. And that distinction matters. When Barry discussed Sanders, he sounded invested in a developmental journey that was already taking place. When he discussed Watson, the conversation shifted toward possibilities, toward hypotheticals, toward keeping an open mind about what could happen in the future. One answer felt rooted in observed progress, the other felt rooted in uncertainty. For a fan base that has spent months trying to understand where this quarterback battle is headed, those differences stood out immediately. What's particularly fascinating is how much information can be hidden inside what appears to be a standard football answer. Barry never criticized Watson. He never downplayed his talent. He never questioned his work ethic or preparation. In fact, he carefully avoided saying anything negative at all. That's exactly what an experienced general manager is supposed to do. But sometimes what isn't said becomes just as important as what is. At no point did Barry describe Watson with the same detailed enthusiasm he used when discussing Sanders' growth. There were no extended explanations about development, no timelines, no lengthy discussion of progress over recent months, no detailed breakdown of specific improvements that had impressed the organization. Instead, the focus remained on flexibility. Stay open-minded. Let the competition play out. See what happens. From a public relations standpoint, it's the perfect answer. It protects the organization, it protects the player, and it avoids creating unnecessary controversy. But from an analytical standpoint, it left many listeners wondering whether Barry was carefully managing expectations rather than expressing conviction. And that's why this answer generated so much discussion among Browns fans. Not because Barry said something explosive, but because his language created a striking contrast. One quarterback was discussed through the lens of growth, development, and excitement. The other was discussed through the lens of possibilities and hypothetical outcomes. Whether that difference means anything significant remains to be seen.
Training camp will ultimately determine how this competition unfolds, but the contrast was impossible to miss, and for many observers, it represented the first major sign that the Browns may already be thinking about these two quarterbacks very differently. But if that contrast wasn't enough, Barry's next comments revealed something even more revealing, a philosophy that seemed perfectly designed for one quarterback situation while raising serious questions about the other. As interesting as the contrast between Barry's comments on Shedeur Sanders and Deshaun Watson may have been, the most revealing part of the entire conversation wasn't about either quarterback directly. It was about philosophy. Specifically, the way Andrew Barry described how the Browns evaluate players during this stage of the offseason. At first glance, it sounded like a completely ordinary football discussion, the kind of thing executives say every year when fans and media members start overreacting to OTA highlights and minicamp reports. But when you examine it closely, it becomes clear why so many people believe those comments quietly favored one quarterback over the other.
Barry spent a considerable amount of time talking about development. He emphasized patience. He discussed growth over time rather than judging players based on individual moments. He pushed back against the idea that one throw, one practice, or one bad day should dramatically change anybody's evaluation. Instead, he described a process, a long-term approach focused on improvement, learning, and responding to coaching over the course of weeks and months. Now, on the surface, that's a completely reasonable philosophy. In fact, most successful NFL organizations would probably agree with it. Young players make mistakes, new systems take time to learn, coaches install concepts gradually. Progress isn't always linear. Sometimes a player struggles on Tuesday and looks completely different 2 weeks later. Good organizations understand that. They evaluate trends rather than isolated moments. But here's where things start getting interesting. Think about which quarterback benefits most from that philosophy. If you're talking about a rookie entering the NFL, that framework makes perfect sense. A young quarterback isn't expected to have everything figured out immediately. He's learning a new playbook, adjusting to NFL speed, building chemistry with teammates, making mistakes, receiving corrections, then hopefully showing growth over time. That's exactly what development is supposed to look like. And that's exactly the type of journey Barry seemed to be describing. Throughout his comments, there was a consistent emphasis on improvement rather than perfection. The focus wasn't on whether Sanders had dominated every practice. The focus was on whether he was getting better, whether he was responding to coaching, whether the trajectory was pointing upward. Those are the questions organizations ask when evaluating a young quarterback they believe could become important in the future. Now, compare that to the expectations surrounding a veteran quarterback. A veteran with years of NFL experience is judged differently. That's not unfair, it's reality. When a player has spent nearly a decade in professional football, teams aren't primarily evaluating developmental growth anymore. They're evaluating performance. They're looking for execution, consistency, leadership, production. Veterans are expected to arrive prepared. The learning curve has already happened. That's why Barry's emphasis on development caught so much attention. Many Browns fans couldn't help noticing that the philosophy he described seemed perfectly aligned with Sanders' situation, a young quarterback being judged on his growth over time, a prospect being evaluated based on how he responds to adversity, a player whose future depends on long-term progression rather than immediate perfection. The more Barry talked, the more it sounded like a framework specifically designed for a rookie quarterback. Again, this doesn't mean Sanders has already won the job. It doesn't mean Watson has been eliminated from the competition. Those conclusions would be premature. But it does raise an important question. Why spend so much time explaining a developmental process if your primary focus is a veteran quarterback who has already spent years proving himself in the NFL? That's the question many Browns fans began asking after the interview ended. Because Barry wasn't simply talking about football theory. He was describing how the Browns evaluate talent. He was giving listeners a glimpse into the organization's thought process. And when executives reveal how they think, they often reveal more than they intend to. What's particularly fascinating is how often successful NFL teams talk about development right before a major transition occurs. They begin emphasizing growth, they highlight progress, they discuss the future rather than the past. Gradually, the conversation shifts away from what a player has already accomplished and toward what another player might become. Some Browns fans believe that's exactly what's happening here, not because Barry announced it, not because someone leaked information, but because the language surrounding the quarterback room seems to be evolving. The focus appears increasingly centered on potential, growth, and long-term development. Those are the kinds of conversations organizations have when they're looking ahead rather than looking back. And if that's truly the direction Cleveland is moving, it would explain why Barry sounded so invested when discussing Sanders' progress over the past several months. It would explain why he repeatedly returned to concepts like growth, patience, and developmental arcs. It would explain why his answers seemed to carry an undercurrent of optimism whenever the rookie quarterback entered the discussion. But philosophy alone doesn't win football games. Eventually, organizations have to put their beliefs into action. They have to build rosters, hire coaches, and create systems that support the future they envision. And that's where the next piece of this story becomes impossible to ignore. Because while most people were focused on the quarterback battle itself, the Browns may have been quietly rebuilding their entire offense around a very specific vision. And once you look at the changes they've made, the picture becomes even more intriguing. At this point, some people might argue that we're reading too much into Andrew Barry's comments. Maybe the praise for Shedeur Sanders was simply encouragement. Maybe the discussion about development was just standard football philosophy. Maybe the contrast between Sanders and Watson isn't as significant as it appears. Those are fair points, but this is where the conversation takes another turn. Because when you shift your attention away from the quarterbacks themselves and start looking at what the Browns have actually been building around them, a much larger picture begins to emerge.
One of the most overlooked parts of Barry's media tour had nothing to do with quarterback rankings or training camp battles. It was his discussion of the offense itself. The way he described Cleveland's offensive evolution sounded less like a team making short-term adjustments and more like an organization laying the foundation for something much bigger. Think about everything that's changed over a relatively short period of time. The Browns didn't simply tweak a few things and call in an offseason. They've reshaped major parts of their offensive identity. New coaching voices have entered the building. New personnel have been added. New weapons have been brought in. Different concepts are being emphasized. Different philosophies are being discussed. And when Barry explained these moves, he consistently described them as parts of a larger plan, rather than isolated transactions. That's what caught people's attention. Organizations don't accidentally transform multiple areas of their offense at the same time. Every draft pick, every coaching hire, every personnel decision is connected to a broader vision. Teams are always asking the same question: what type of offense are we trying to become over the next several years? And according to many fans and analysts, the answer to that question may reveal more about the quarterback situation than any press conference ever could. When Barry discussed the offensive structure, he talked about creating an environment where the quarterback can succeed. On the surface, that's a completely normal objective. Every team wants to support its quarterback. Every front office wants to surround the position with talent. But the scale of what Cleveland appears to be doing has led many people to wonder whether they're preparing for more than just a one-year experiment. Because let's be honest, teams don't usually redesign significant portions of their offensive ecosystem for a temporary solution. They don't bring in new ideas, invest premium resources, and establish long-term developmental systems if they believe the quarterback at the center of everything is simply a short-term placeholder. That's not how successful franchises operate. When organizations make sweeping changes, it's often because they're building toward a future they expect to last. That's where the Shedeur Sanders conversation becomes impossible to separate from the broader roster construction. Again, let's be clear about something. There has been no official announcement that this offense is being built specifically for Sanders. No one inside the organization has said that publicly. Any suggestion otherwise would be speculation. But what many observers have noticed is that the Browns' recent decisions seem to align remarkably well with the needs of a young quarterback entering the early stages of his NFL career. Young quarterbacks thrive when they're surrounded by support. They benefit from reliable weapons. They benefit from coaching stability. They benefit from offensive systems that emphasize growth and development rather than forcing immediate perfection. Most importantly, they benefit when organizations create an environment designed to help them succeed rather than simply survive. When Barry described Cleveland's offensive changes, that's exactly what many listeners heard. Not a bridge offense, not a temporary setup, not a roster being patched together for one final run. Instead, they heard an executive describing infrastructure, the kind of infrastructure organizations build when they believe they're preparing for a long-term future. And the timing makes this discussion even more fascinating. Remember, the Browns didn't enter this offseason operating from a position of certainty. They entered it with one of the most complicated quarterback situations in football. Questions existed everywhere. Questions about Watson, questions about Sanders, questions about the future of the offense itself. Yet despite all that uncertainty, the organization still moved aggressively to reshape key parts of its offensive operation. That tells us something. It tells us the Browns have a vision. The question is whether that vision is centered on the present or the future. Because if the goal was simply to maximize one final opportunity with a veteran quarterback, the approach might look very different. Organizations in that position often focus on immediate fixes. They chase quick solutions. They prioritize the short term because their competitive window is shrinking. What Barry described felt different. His comments sounded like someone discussing a multi-year project, a carefully constructed environment designed to develop and sustain success rather than create a temporary spark. That's why so many fans left the interview wondering whether the Browns already know where they're headed, even if they're not ready to publicly admit it. And if that wasn't enough, there's another piece of this puzzle that may be even more revealing. Because while Barry was discussing offensive growth and long-term planning, the owner of the franchise had already delivered a statement that sent shockwaves through Cleveland, a statement that many people believe changed the entire conversation surrounding the quarterback position. And once that comment entered the picture, the speculation surrounding the Browns' future reached an entirely different level.
If Andrew Barry's comments planted the seeds of speculation, the remarks made by Browns owner Jimmy Haslam poured gasoline on the fire. Because while front office executives are trained to speak carefully, owners occasionally say things that reveal far more than intended. And when Haslam addressed the Deshaun Watson situation earlier in the offseason, his words immediately became one of the most discussed topics among Browns fans. The reason was simple. He didn't sound like someone defending a decision. He sounded like someone reflecting on one. For years, the Watson acquisition has hovered over every major conversation surrounding the Browns. It wasn't just another trade. It wasn't just another contract. It was one of the most significant moves in franchise history. The organization committed enormous resources to make it happen. Expectations skyrocketed overnight. The hope was that Cleveland had finally found the quarterback who could stabilize the position for years to come. Instead, the story unfolded very differently. Injuries, inconsistency, and constant questions prevented the partnership from becoming what many expected. As the seasons passed, frustration grew. The excitement that once surrounded the move gradually gave way to uncertainty. Fans began debating whether the Browns would ever receive the return they expected from such a massive investment. That's why Haslam's comments hit so hard. When discussing the Watson era, he used a phrase that immediately grabbed headlines. He referred to the move as a swing and a miss. 4 simple words, but those 4 words carried enormous weight because they came from the very top of the organization. Think about that for a moment. Owners rarely publicly acknowledge mistakes of that magnitude, especially when those decisions involve hundreds of millions of dollars, years of planning, and some of the biggest headlines in franchise history. Most organizations prefer to move quietly. They avoid revisiting painful decisions. They focus on the future and leave the past alone.
Haslam didn't do that. Instead, he openly addressed the outcome and delivered a statement that many fans interpreted as an admission that the vision surrounding Watson had not unfolded the way the organization originally hoped. Now, to be fair, Haslam never said Watson couldn't contribute moving forward. He never announced the end of Watson's time in Cleveland. He never suggested that training camp was merely a formality. Any claims beyond that would be speculation. But what he did do was introduce a level of public doubt that simply didn't exist before. And that's where Andrew Berry's response became so fascinating. When asked about the owner's comments, Berry handled the situation exactly the way a veteran executive would. He remained calm, he remained professional. He emphasized that internal evaluations are based on performance, preparation, and what players actually do on the field, not on public narratives or media discussions. Objectively speaking, that's the correct answer. A front office cannot allow outside noise to determine personnel decisions. Coaches can't make lineup choices based on headlines. Executives can't change evaluations because of public pressure. Successful organizations separate emotion from football decisions. Berry's answer reflected that principle perfectly. But many listeners weren't focused on what Berry said. They were focused on what he didn't say. At no point did Berry push back against the owner's characterization. He didn't attempt to reframe it. He didn't suggest the owner's comments were being misunderstood. He didn't strongly defend the long-term outlook surrounding Watson. Instead, he acknowledged the question, emphasized professionalism, and moved forward. For some fans, that silence was incredibly revealing. Again, it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't confirm that the Browns have moved on internally. It doesn't guarantee that Watson won't compete for the starting job. Those conclusions go beyond the available facts. But it does explain why so many people left that interview with lingering questions. Because in situations like this, strong endorsements are usually easy to recognize. When organizations truly believe a player remains central to their future plans, they often go out of their way to communicate confidence. They emphasize leadership, they highlight progress, they reinforce commitment, they actively shape the narrative. Many Browns fans expected some version of that response. Instead, Berry chose neutrality. And while neutrality is often the safest option, it also left room for interpretation. That's why Haslam's comments continue to loom over this quarterback battle. They created a backdrop that influences every conversation about the position, every statement about development, every discussion about the future, every evaluation of training camp performance. Whether fair or unfair, the words changed how people view the competition. Suddenly, fans weren't just evaluating throws and practice reports anymore. They were trying to understand where the organization itself stands. They were trying to determine whether Cleveland is still searching for answers or whether the next chapter has already begun behind closed doors. And when you combine Haslam's comments with Berry's comments about development, growth, and long-term planning, it's easy to understand why speculation has intensified across the fan base. Because by this point, many Browns supporters believe they're seeing a pattern emerge. Not a confirmation, not an announcement,
but a pattern. And when all those pieces are placed side by side, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Has the organization already started shifting its focus toward a different future? That's exactly why the next part of this story may be the most important of all. Because once you connect all the clues together, you begin to understand why so many Browns fans believe the decision may already be much closer than anyone is willing to admit publicly. At this stage, it's important to separate facts from speculation. The fact is that the Browns have not officially named a starting quarterback. The fact is that training camp has not yet delivered the kind of live competition that ultimately decides these battles. And the fact that Andrew Berry, Kevin Stefanski, and the rest of the organization continue to publicly describe this as an open competition. Those facts matter, and ignoring them would be unfair to everyone involved. But there's another fact that matters just as much. A growing portion of the Browns fan base no longer believes this story is truly about who wins the competition. They believe it's about when the organization feels comfortable revealing its choice. Now, to be clear, that's a belief held by many fans and analysts, not a confirmed reality. The Browns themselves have never publicly stated that a decision has already been made. Yet the reason this belief continues to gain traction is because so many different pieces seem to point in the same direction. Think about everything we've discussed so far. You have Barry's unusually detailed praise regarding Shedeur Sanders' development. You have the emphasis on growth, patience, and long-term progression. You have the contrast between the way Sanders and Watson were discussed. You have organizational changes that many observers believe align with the development of a young quarterback. And then you have Jimmy Haslam's public comments hanging over the entire situation. Individually, each piece can be explained away. Together, they become much harder to ignore. That's why Browns fans across social media, sports radio, podcasts, and message boards continue returning to the same question. If the organization truly views both quarterbacks equally, why does the language surrounding them feel so different? It's a question that has fueled endless debates throughout the offseason. Some fans argue that people are simply overanalyzing normal front office language. They believe Barry is doing exactly what a general manager should do, encouraging a young player while remaining respectful toward a veteran. According to that perspective, the quarterback battle remains exactly what the Browns say it is, an open competition that will be decided on the field. But others see something very different. They believe the organization's comments reveal subtle signs of where things are headed. Not because someone leaked information, not because an insider broke the story, but because executives often reveal their priorities without realizing how much they're saying. The fascinating part is that this debate has evolved far beyond football. This isn't just about arm strength, it's not just about accuracy, it's not even just about practice performance anymore. The conversation has become psychological. Fans are analyzing tone, word choice, body language, organizational behavior, and long-term planning. They're looking for clues in places where official announcements haven't yet arrived. And honestly, that's what happens when a fan base spends years searching for stability at the most important position in sports. Cleveland fans have lived through quarterback competitions before. They've heard optimistic off-season narratives before. They've seen training camp storylines rise and fall before. That's exactly why so many supporters are paying attention to the details rather than simply waiting for headlines. Because sometimes, organizations tell you what they're thinking long before they tell you what they're doing. One of the most interesting aspects of this entire situation is how naturally the public conversation has shifted toward the future. Notice how often discussions about Sanders focus on what he could become rather than what he currently is. Notice how frequently fans talk about development, growth, and long-term potential. Notice how often the conversation revolves around years rather than months. That shift didn't happen by accident. Somewhere along the way, the dialogue surrounding the Browns changed. The focus gradually moved away from repairing the past and toward building the future. Whether that future ultimately belongs to Sanders remains unknown, but the direction of the conversation itself is difficult to ignore. Reports from practices have only added fuel to the discussion. Every strong throw becomes evidence for one side. Every mistake becomes evidence for the other. Every media appearance is dissected frame by frame. Every comment from coaches, teammates, and executives generates another round of debate. And through it all, one thing remains remarkably consistent. The excitement surrounding Sanders continues to grow. Again, excitement is not proof. Enthusiasm is not confirmation. The Browns still have decisions to make. Watson remains part of the competition. Coaches still need to evaluate live football situations once pads come on and preseason games begin. But perception matters. And right now, the perception among many Browns fans is that the organization appears increasingly energized by the possibility of what Sanders could become.
That's why so many people believe the competition may already be leaning in a particular direction, not because someone announced it, not because the Browns admitted it, but because every conversation seems to circle back to the same place: the future. The future of the offense, the future of the quarterback room, the future of the franchise. And when a fan base starts hearing the same message from multiple angles, speculation becomes inevitable. The question now isn't whether Browns fans believe something significant is happening behind the scenes. The question is, what happens if they're right? Because if Cleveland ultimately decides to hand the keys to a rookie quarterback, the ripple effects could reshape not only the Browns' immediate future, but the entire NFL conversation surrounding one of the league's most fascinating quarterback stories.